The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The topic of gay marriage has sort of faded from the presidential election on the Republican side. We haven't heard as much anti-gay stuff. Certainly haven't really heard almost anything about it during the recent Republican debates. But 4 Republican presidential candidates have signed a pledge to void all the marriages of thousands of same-sex couples if they were to become president. The National Organization for Marriage asked all Republican candidates to pledge support for a new constitutional amendment defining marriage as between a man and a woman. I know it's crazy that I'm still using this language, which would void the thousands of existing same-sex weddings across all 50 states. Incredibly, despite the obviously homophobic measures that the National Organization for Marriage was proposing, 4 of the presidential candidates, obviously all Republicans, signed the pledge. Rick Santorum, Senator Ted Cruz, Dr. Ben Carson, and Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal all agreed and signed on to strip people of the marriages that they already have. Bobby Jindal immediately dropping out of the race after signing the pledge. So his last show of strength, Lewis, just before declaring his campaign a miserable and embarrassing failure and disappearing back into the governor's mansion in Louisiana, was to sign an anti-gay pledge.
Yes, one final last stand of incredible bigotry.
Yeah. It is not a particular surprise from any of these 4 people. They all have vile records of homophobia. Dr. Ben Carson, currently polling second in the field, has claimed that equal marriage is a Marxist plot and says gay sex in prisons proves that sexual orientation is a choice. I still haven't figured that one out. Ted Cruz recently referred to Ellen Page, the actress, as a, quote, liberal fascist for asking him about LGBT rights. Rick Santorum thinks gay people can be cured and that letting them marry will cause some kind of global crisis. And then Bobby Jindal is in Louisiana actively trying to introduce laws permitting discrimination against same-sex couples. This remains, for me, an issue where as soon as you talk about denying gay people rights as part of your campaign, you have zero credibility. When you say 2 consenting, loving adults who happen to be of the same gender should not be allowed to marry each other, you instantly lose credibility on economic issues. You lose credibility on science issues. You lose credibility on any issue of any importance whatsoever. And it is amazing to me that the Republican Party has not, I'm not saying that the Republican Party should just say, hey, we love gays and it's all great and blah, blah, blah. It seems unlikely they're going to do that. But at least come together and say, hey, guys, pragmatically, we've got to drop the gay stuff because this is not going to get us anywhere. This is totally retrograde. It doesn't fit. And you still see the homophobic elements of the Republican Party.
I'm sure there are plenty of conservatives, politicians who are just saying these things because their constituents want to hear it, because they think it's going to help them win election, re-election, whatever. And I don't necessarily think that a politician who says this loses credibility on perhaps economic issues or fiscal issues in general when they say something like this. But
maybe not among their supporters.
Right. But I mean, to me, what happens when they say something like this is I say, this person is morally bankrupt. Clearly, and I don't need to hear anything else they have to say because they're morally bankrupt to me, and they're just out. They're out. Nothing else matters.
Senator Rand Paul, running as a Republican presidential candidate, posted a video clip on Facebook a few days ago from a live broadcast on the Iowa talk radio station WHO, where he challenged Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders to a debate. He said, quote, "We've been saying what a fun, dramatic, and informative debate it would be if Bernie Sanders and I could have an hour-long debate. Can you imagine debating over what rights are versus what obligations are and debating socialism versus capitalism? See, Bernie, he says, oh, I believe in a benign form of socialism, democratic socialism. But here's the problem. If a majoritarian takes away your rights, it's not any different or less bad than an authoritarian taking away your rights." I don't know if this debate is going to happen. Bernie Sanders' campaign has not commented on this. Rand Paul says he would debate Bernie Sanders anytime, any place. I would love to see this. And not because I think necessarily that Bernie Sanders is a better debater or because I think that Rand Paul's ideas are ideas that I believe in, but because these are two of the guys that are most able to have a substantive conversation that are currently running. Certainly Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders can have substantive conversations about political issues. On the Republican side, you don't have that many candidates who can really go in depth. Donald Trump, no. Ben Carson, I just told you 2 days ago that his advisors are saying this guy just does not understand foreign policy. We're intensively coaching him, and he just doesn't understand anything that's going on. Rand Paul is one of the guys that can go deeper on these issues, and I would love to see that debate, not even for the purposes of deciding who to vote for. I would just think that would be a great debate.
You're right. It would be very fun to watch, but the only way it will happen is if Rand Paul becomes the Republican nominee and Bernie Sanders becomes the Democratic nominee, and they debate in a presidential debate, because otherwise there is absolutely no point for Bernie to do it. It's just, I mean, even though it could help him, it might not, and so there's no point.
And it actually might be against some rules. I don't know if these would be like internal DNC and RNC rules, or if it would be against, I don't know. But a couple people sent me the story, and they said, I don't think that the candidates would really be allowed to do this. You would think, though, that if this is not an officially sanctioned event by a party, they could say, hey, we're both going to be interviewed at the same time on a particular show, and questions about socialism versus libertarianism or whatever may come up. I don't see how you can really prevent the candidates from just appearing in public and having a conversation.
No, if it's not an official debate in any capacity, you can do whatever you want, right? I mean, they could have a couple of schmucks like us just set up a few cameras and say, okay, guys, go at it, right?
I think they would love it if Lewis showed up and ran tech for that debate. I can't imagine anything they would like more. The other thing is, of course, in the discussions about this debate, it's completely ignored that Bernie Sanders is a democratic socialist rather than a socialist. Rand Paul sort of refers to it saying, oh, Bernie claims to have this belief in a benign form of socialism called democratic socialism, but it's all socialism. There are significant differences between, quote, socialism and the very specific set of beliefs, democratic socialist ideas that Bernie Sanders has been talking about. And I would hope that in this hypothetical debate that will never happen, that would be made clear, that we're talking about Rand Paul's set of beliefs versus Bernie Sanders' democratic socialism.
That's one of Bernie's struggles, right? Trying to communicate to people exactly what his belief system is called, and trying to, make people realize that socialist is not necessarily a dirty word.
And increasingly, fortunately, polls are showing us that socialist is not nearly as much of a dirty word as it once was. And that at least will allow for a broader debate of ideas, which is a good thing. It's exactly what we need. Why not bring Hatriot Mail into your own home? This image that you see behind me is one of the great viewer-created images that is part of this that I hold in front of me today, the 2016 Hatriot Mail calendar. We did one of these calendars last year in 2015, and we shipped out 122. My goal for this season is 200 calendars. So far, we have 80 calendars spoken for, meaning that we are almost halfway there. We are 40% of the way there, if my quick math serves me. And we have 120 calendars to go. You can get the calendar autographed or not autographed, but you can also get the calendar for free if you want, which may come as a shock to many people. If you have been thinking about becoming a David Pakman Show member, you can get the calendar for free if you sign up for a membership, and here's the key, at davidpakman.com/calendar16. If you go to davidpakman.com/calendar16, you can get this calendar shipped to you for free, assuming you live in the U.S., shipping extra outside Lewis because, it's pretty expensive to send stuff to Singapore, where we recently shipped a calendar. Very, very exciting stuff. Now, if we don't get to the 200, Lewis, you're willing to get a few orders of these, right?
Well, I'm willing to accept a few.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay. So Lewis is not going to be.
You got to cut me a break here. I have about 3 million memberships. How many?
Yeah,
how many
Lewis
of those
is
do you want me to
focusing his
buy?
support on the show via memberships rather than via calendars. So Clearly, we can't count on Lewis to get us over that number of 200. So I'm hoping that you will get us to that 200 number. We want to get 200 of these calendars out. Last year, 122. This year, shooting for 200. Lewis, you paged through this thing the other day. This is quite a calendar, is it not?
I like it, yeah. And last year, I contributed an image. I did not this year, but
you didn't have to.
Yeah, there are some. Luckily, I didn't have to.
Correct.
Look at the one behind Dave. It's great.
I think this, I don't want to say, I just don't remember exactly who did this one. But that's the other thing. The calendar also has credits for every single viewer that contributed an image, which I know for Lewis attribution, proper attribution, typically in MLA format, is very, very important. And I know, Lewis, you were satisfied to see that.
100% satisfied, yes.
DavidPakman.com/calendar16. Get the calendar for free. After the break, we're going to go back to something Marco Rubio said about global warming, climate change, creation, about a bunch of stuff a while back. And in the audience questions segment for today, we will discuss the paramount issue of, could you have a significant other or spouse with drastically different political views or religious views? Lewis will address that. I will address that. Today, it is the Friday show. Stay with us.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Our program is funded by the audience through membership, and today's new member of the day is Alicia Ford. Alicia, thank you so much for being a member. You can join Alicia at davidpakman.com/membership, and of course, get yourself a Hatriot Mail calendar with your membership for free. This is the calendar here. I have it. It's pretty compelling, I'm not going to lie. At davidpakman.com/calendar16. That is the place to get the calendar for free, or just the calendar if you want. 3 years ago this week, Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio said that Earth may have been created literally in 7 days, adding that, "I'm not a scientist, man." The Earth being created in 7 literal days, modern 24-hour days, obviously isn't real, but that may not stop Marco Rubio from being the Republican presidential nominee. I guess it's good that he added he's not a scientist, but this "I'm not a scientist" thing has taken on a life of its own, as if we couldn't tell, right?
Yeah, it's nice of him to add that, but if you're not a scientist, don't weigh in on the first place. Scientists are in agreement, Dave. They are all pretty sure that the Earth is not 6,000 years old.
Back in that same show 3 years ago, we talked about physicist Bill Foster being elected to Congress, and we wondered about what it would take to have more scientists in elected office. And unfortunately, or fortunately for the scientific world, scientists tend to stick more to their respective fields and don't enter into politics quite as often as maybe we would like. And it leaves our congressional science boards and committees full of people like Marco Rubio, full of people like James Inhofe, who said, what was it he said? Something about like a literal belief in hell, or so. I don't even remember now. God would not allow climate change. God would not set up a planet for us that humans would be able to alter in a way that was bad. Maybe Neil deGrasse Tyson needs to run for president at some point.
Don't underestimate the power of celebrities running for president, Dave. Remember that whole Stephen Colbert thing?
Yeah.
I mean, it seemed like he would have had a lot of support. It was pretty good.
He may well have, yeah. And sometimes Clay Aiken ran, and it did not go well. And he actually had mostly policies I agreed with. I mean, I actually thought that he was quite smart. And even though he came from American Idol, if you listen to what he said, it actually made a lot of sense. But the celebrity races often don't turn out that well.
Well, we did have a movie star who became president, Dave. You remember him, right? Republicans love
Dwight
him.
D. Eisenhower, right?
Yeah.
Now, Ronald Reagan, of course.
Good old Reagan.
All right. 2 years ago this week, Alec Baldwin called a photographer a sea-sucking fag. Baldwin had a history of losing his temper with photographers, which is sort of understandable if you constantly have photographers in your face. And he had at the time, he had a show Up Late with Alec Baldwin on MSNBC. It had only aired 4 times. It wasn't doing well. It presented a great opportunity for MSNBC to can the show, which they did after the sea-sucking fag incident. Alec Baldwin blamed the, quote, fundamentalist wing of gay advocacy for the show's cancellation. But what can you really expect to happen after you say something like that?
Yeah, it was bound to happen. Now, we didn't really sympathize with Alec Baldwin. I mean, but we did discuss that it can be difficult to kind of lose those slang terms you use. You use it throughout your childhood and, your young adult life. And it can be hard to break that habit, but still, you need to know at that age.
At that age and at this level of public notoriety, you need to know. It's kind of like, okay, if someone uses the term retarded to say that something is bad or stupid or whatever, that doesn't mean that they think negatively of people with Down syndrome merely because those people have Down syndrome, right? It doesn't mean that, but it's still an insensitive term that for some people that I know seems to be harder to stop using than for others. But it doesn't necessarily tell us that they have negative feelings about people with Down syndrome.
Right.
Sometimes people will use the term fag, and there's no doubt that the term is insensitive and defensive as a reference to members of the LGBT community. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those individuals think less of people who are part of the LGBT community because they are part of that community. Alec Baldwin here used a term that was offensive. There's no doubt that it's an offensive term. It's not a term that I use. But I don't think that Alec Baldwin, from a standpoint of gay rights, thinks of gay people as less. Now, you could say the fact that he hasn't successfully weeded out that term from his vocabulary tells us that he must at least be indifferent as to how offensive it is to gay people. And that's certainly an argument you could make. But I think it's important to remember that these distinctions can exist, not to defend or support the use of any of these terms.
For sure. And it's probably better than physically assaulting the photographer, which I believe he has done before. Yeah, I guess that's better.
This incident had an impact on his MSNBC career, but not on his movie career, which seems to still be doing very well. 1 year ago this week, a Saudi man divorced his wife after seeing her for the first time, seeing her face for the first time, as if not being able to cohabitate, have sex, or even see your partner naked before getting married wasn't bad enough. There are some places where you might not even see the face of your future spouse until the deal is sealed. Who can we blame here? I mean, was this an arranged marriage and therefore perhaps the fault of the parents? Did the bride and groom agree on this together, in which case I guess they could blame themselves? We could blame the religious status quo, which suggested this harebrained idea. I don't know. My only advice would be don't let this be you. See what your partner looks like before you marry them.
Yes, I think that is fair. Dave, let's not stop there. Cohabitate.
Yeah.
You need to know these things because otherwise you're setting yourself up for disaster. Dave, it's bad enough in this country we have a divorce rate that I believe is over 50%.
It is.
I don't know what the divorce rate is like in the parts of the world we're talking about here. It's probably lower because there's probably way more of a taboo on divorce. But crazy situation.
But wouldn't God be angry if you see your future wife's face before you're married? Wouldn't that cause God to be angry?
I don't think God cares at all what you do with your future wife, except for maybe killing her or torturing her or something like that. If it's mutual, Dave, I think it's all good. I don't think God cares.
You mean if both people in the relationship say, hey, what the hell, let's look at each other's faces before we get married, God would be okay with that?
I think that would be okay. I think you can lift up the burqa.
Now, you're not a legal scholar.
A legal scholar? or I'm not a
You're not a religious scholar for sure.
Or a religious scholar of any sort, Dave. But my opinion on God, I think, is equal. Still, all the same.
All right, fair enough. If we are off on any of these stories, let us know on Twitter at David Pakman Show. We will take a break. We have a terrific interview coming up today, very relevant given what's going on with Syria.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
The talk of Syria has continued to grow since these latest attacks in Paris and, of course, the Syrian presence of ISIS among in other countries as well. And for today's classic interview, I want to take you back to September of 2013. Fantastic interview with Lawrence Wilkerson, Chief of Staff to former Secretary of State Colin Powell. We interviewed him and we talked about the intelligence case that at the time was being made in Syria. We talked about his involvement in Colin Powell's infamous case to the UN for war in Iraq. And I think that now that we are going back to making cases for military action, it would be very interesting and very important to remember and to hear from a very highly placed individual who was involved in these negotiations, how the negotiations happen, how poor intelligence can be used to improperly influence certain military moves. Now, to be clear, this is not an interview that we are airing today to oppose a particular action against ISIS or to favor it, but merely to remind ourselves of when we look back at how these military decisions are made, this type of interference, this type of subterfuge, this type of incompetence can exist. So let's go back to September of 2013. Lawrence Wilkerson joined me. I'm joined by Lawrence Wilkerson. He's a visiting professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary. He also served as chief of staff to former Secretary of State Colin Powell, and he was responsible for a review of information from the CIA that was used to prepare Colin Powell for his February 2003 presentation to the UN Security Council during the run-up to the war in Iraq. Professor, it's really a pleasure to have you here. Since your role, as I described, in that position of chief of staff with Colin Powell, you have criticized the intelligence that was used to make that case that we are now all intimately familiar for the case for war in Iraq, and you're concerned now about the intelligence being used in Syria. Let's start there.
I'm concerned about intelligence from 2 points of view with regard to Syria, and they both relate back to the Iraq war and the occasions you've just described. The first concern I have is the intelligence what we're looking at? That is to say, have the intelligence professionals put forward their views, and are those views in an unadulterated way being presented to the American people and to their representatives in the Congress? That's the first concern. You might call it a concern about politicization of the intelligence. The second concern is with the intelligence itself. Any intelligence professional, and I've worked with them for over 40 years, will tell you that any good intelligence service is probably right or near right about 60% of the time. That's all you can expect. So that's a wide margin for error, 40% of the time. So those two concerns relate to Syria as much as they did to Iraq, with Iraq having been a really egregious case of politicians cherry-picking the intelligence to make it fit their policy rather than taking all the intelligence and letting it inform their policy.
So to ask about Syria, let me ask a question about Iraq, and then we can kind of go from there. At the time that you were reviewing that information from the CIA that Secretary Powell eventually used to make the case for Iraq, were there candid discussions that you were involved in or privy to where the validity of the intelligence was being questioned, or was it after the fact that that came to light?
Both. There were some very dramatic moments in the preparation. We only had 5 days and nights out at Langley, the CIA headquarters, and then 1 day and a night in New York as we got ready to present to the Security Council. I remember three very dramatic moments. I'll relate a couple to you. Secretary Powell had taken me aside and put me into a room and closed the door in the National Intelligence Council spaces in the CIA headquarters. And he had said he was utterly disgusted with the information in his presentation about terrorism and about the connections between Baghdad with Al-Qaeda in particular. There didn't seem to be any. And I was very comfortable with that. I told him he didn't need to get angry with me. I'd be more than willing to take it out. Went right out and told his speechwriter, who was sitting in front of the computer actually preparing the preparation in terms of narrative, and told her to take it completely out. Everything about connections between Baghdad and essentially their secret police, their Mukhabarat, and Al Qaeda. Within an hour, George Tenet dropped a bombshell in his conference room where we had reconvened to begin rehearsing again, and said that a high-level Al Qaeda operative under interrogation had just revealed substantial contacts between the Mukhabarat and Al Qaeda operatives, including training those operatives in how to use chemical and biological weapons. Well, this was a bombshell. And so we put that back into the presentation. There were dramatic moments like that about Saddam's active nuclear program with regard to the aluminum tubes and so forth, and other instances where we were very skeptical, even so skeptical as in the case of the mobile biological labs, for example, and also the one I just related to you about the terrorism context, that we actually moved to eliminate them from his presentation, only to have the DCI, George Tenet, accompanied by his deputy, John McLaughlin, give us some kind of dramatic story that compelled us to put it back in.
So based on that, then, we might have a situation now with the case being made for Syria where the information, the intelligence is being presented in good faith, and it might at some future point turn out to have been wrong. But based on the conversations you're describing, there may be a case being presented now with information that is known to be maybe not wrong, but certainly not strong. Is that a possibility?
I think it's fair to say that some of the information may be being presented as very, very strong because it fits the policy directive, it fits the policy objective. And in that case, you may be guilty of a little bit more sophisticated cherry picking, but it is cherry picking nonetheless. I do think, from what I've heard inside the intelligence community, inside the Pentagon, from Beirut, from Damascus, where I have people who actually email me and talk to me about the civil war, I think chemical weapons have been used multiple times over the past 6 to 12 months. There have been small instances. Clearly, I think the 21 August use was the largest, or at least the largest reported incident. And the UN has now concluded its investigations, and there is a likelihood that someone within the government probably authorized, whether it was Assad or not, we do not know, probably authorized this use of chemical weapons. It's still ambiguous to the point where I wouldn't say with certitude that's the case, but I would say that I have a stronger feeling now after all these conversations with people inside and outside the intelligence community, and also with the reports coming from the UN team, that somehow, somewhere, the government probably was involved in this use of chemical weapons. Now, it might indeed have been a response to some of these other instances where the opposition was using chemical weapons, predominantly sarin, or watered down sarin, I would say. So it's still ambiguous as to exactly what the tit for tat is in Syria with regard to chemical weapons use.
In the last couple of minutes we have, I want to take this conversation about the strength of intelligence that's used when these cases are made and kind of ask a different question. Back when you were involved in the discussions you talked about earlier, are we going to include the connection between Al Qaeda and Saddam, or are we not, and these types of things? Were there ever moments where you stepped back, and I don't know if this includes Secretary Powell or not, and there's a kind of a candid conversation about what really might be at the root of wanting to make this case in the first place? Like, does the term military-industrial complex, or does oil, do any of these things come up candidly when you're sitting in those backroom meetings planning this case that will be made? Or is that kind of understood and not mentioned at all?
The latter is more often the case in my experience. I've served 3 presidents fairly closely. And let me go back to the first Gulf War, where I was special assistant to Colin Powell when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Yes, there was mention of oil, and yes, there was a putting down on the ground early on the 82nd Airborne troops to keep Saddam from turning right, as it were, and going into Saudi Arabia, where, for example, Ras Tanura, I think, was pumping 6 million barrels per day, one of the greatest production capacities in the world, of course, and we didn't want Saddam having control of that. But you don't hear that discussed really, even at the highest levels, as objectives, as reasons. It may come up, someone may nod, someone may blink, someone may nod his head as if, yes, I agree, and so forth. But it's clear that those are the reasons that you're doing what you're doing. Let's just face it, ever since Franklin Roosevelt and the king in Saudi Arabia talked, and Jimmy Carter laid down the gauntlet at the end of his administration and said that the Persian Gulf was a vital national interest to the United States of America, we have been using military force, diplomacy, and other means in that area to protect oil, period.
All right, we've been speaking with Professor Lawrence Wilkerson. He is a visiting professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary. Couldn't be more appreciative for your insight. I mean, this is really fascinating stuff, and I think our audience really enjoys hearing what these discussions are like behind the scenes. So I hope you'll join us again. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
For the first time from the Boston studio, it is time for audience questions. You can submit the questions via voicemail, email, Twitter, Facebook. YouTube's a little tough because we get a lot of comments. It's hard to figure out what's going on. On our Reddit discussion forum at davidpakman.com/Reddit. However you want, let us know it's a Friday show question. First question today is a voicemail question. The number is 219-2DavidP. It is a very interesting question. Let's take a listen to it.
Hey, David, it's Ian. I had a question. Do you think it's possible for relationships to last if, say, one of the partners has a different political philosophy from the other partner or religious philosophy? Say, one of the partners was conservative and the other one was more liberal, or one happened to be a Catholic and the other happened to be an atheist or a human secularist? I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
Okay. Yes. I mean, relationships can last. Look at this happy couple on the screen, Mary Madeline and James Carville. Mary Madeline, a Republican advisor, James Carville, a Democratic strategist. And they've been together for a long time. And I don't know if they just don't talk about politics or how the whole thing works. Clearly, it can work. But I think that it's all on a spectrum, Lewis. And if you have someone who is a devout fundamentalist Muslim who can't I don't know, do anything right before marriage, and the other person is a sort of, I don't know, cultural non-religious Jew, like one of us or something like that, it's hard to imagine it ever getting to the point of being a lasting relationship in the first place, isn't it?
It is. Everyone's different. Everyone has a different threshold for what they can tolerate. The religious stuff seems to be a little bit different because if you follow your religion, there are codes, right? Whereas if you are a liberal or a Republican, there really are no codes. It's kind of arbitrary, and there's not really a life system in place that you need to follow. So it's tougher with religion.
I recently, or all the time, but recently there's one particular couple I met where I met the wife in the couple. It's a heterosexual couple. And the wife said, oh, yeah, I've seen some of your show, and I lean more left, and I really like a lot of what you have to say, but, my husband's a former Navy SEAL, and he is very conservative, very right-wing, and, I don't think it's the type of thing he would like. And she just says it so casually, as if it's completely normal to have a progressive and a sort of militaristic, very right-wing, so-called patriot Navy SEAL who has the Tea Party beliefs, as she went on to talk to me about, and these things that fall under the banner of patriotism. The only way I can imagine that being reasonable is if politics are not important to at least one of the people, right? If you have the right winger who cares about politics and the left winger who is left wing but doesn't really care about politics, they just vote for whoever's the most liberal, I can see that. But if both people are very actively engaged in politics, with the rare exceptions like Mary Madeline and James Carville, how could that really work? I just don't understand from a day-to-day level how that works.
Either you avoid the topic, maybe you just really enjoy some good, passionate debate about the topic with your partner, maybe that's what they do. I couldn't tell you, but it can still work. Of course, that's an example of it. I certainly don't know any couples like that.
What would be more difficult for you, Lewis, to be with someone whose political views were drastically different? And maybe you'll talk to us about this this date you had with the right winger. That would be an interesting story. Maybe not today. You know, I don't want to push it on Lewis. Someone who has different political views, or someone who has drastically different religious views. What would be more of a challenge to you?
Well, considering I really have no religious views.
Well, but someone who does then would have different religious views
Yeah.
than you.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah, that's fair. What would be more difficult for me to deal with, for me to handle? You know, probably the political stuff.
Really?
Probably, because if you have some literal interpretations of your Bible, okay, you think the Earth is 6,000 years old. I think that's kind of silly, but is that really going to be a deal breaker? You know, maybe not. But if you think that all the poor should be sent to an island, and that the mentally ill as well, and we should increase our defense spending by 5,000%, and cut food stamps, et cetera, I think that would bother me a lot more.
That's a good example, but let me issue a different example. You could date someone who is anti-gay, but she's not out there. She's not gay bashing, right? She's anti-gay. She's against gay marriage. She doesn't think gay people. She thinks people choose to be gay, and as such, they should be discriminated against because it's a bad choice, whatever. And on the other hand, you have someone who says, "Okay, I'm religious. Friday nights, yeah, I go to mass on Friday nights. I'm Catholic, and every Sunday I also go." And also, I kind of need you to participate in grace when you come to family dinners and blah, blah, blah. That could be pretty trying, I would imagine.
Yeah, that would be. But that's the thing. Are they practicing that religion on their own, or are they forcing it on me? I don't know. Are they forcing their politics on me? Every situation's different, you know?
Every situation is certainly different, that's for sure. Second question today. David, this is from Hermosa. David, why do you sometimes change clothes during the show and then change back? Let me be very clear here. I never change clothes during the show. What sometimes happens is the interview may have been recorded the previous day. We sometimes have to work around a guest schedule. So I may be wearing the clothes from the previous day's show, which I then was wearing for the interview. And then the next day I'm wearing different clothes. But when we get to the interview portion of the show, I'm wearing the clothes from the previous day. But to my understanding, Lewis, you have changed clothes during the show as the temperature changes. Sometimes you've changed clothes during the show, but I don't know that I actually have done that.
Yeah, well, maybe not so much change, but this, for example, if it's really hot, if it starts getting hot, I may take this off, under which I have a Patriot shirt, which is wonderful. Go Pats. Undefeated, by the way. Wonderful win over the Giants.
9-0 now, right?
9-0. Or alternatively, if I'm just wearing the Patriot shirt, I may put this on if it gets cold. I don't really change. But yes, the answer in most situations is that if you see a change of clothes, it means that clip or segment was recorded on a different day.
Last question today is from Alex. Hello, David and Lewis. I am not a smoker, but I have friends who smoke. Here in New Zealand, the cigarette packaging is covered in health warnings and horrific pictures, but I noticed there is no list of ingredients or any indication of what is inside them. The number of smokers in New Zealand is decreasing, but obviously the warnings are not enough of a deterrent for some people. Wouldn't it be better to also tell smokers exactly what they are consuming? What are your thoughts about ingredients on cigarette packs? Obviously, I'm in favor of that. I mean, if you're consuming stuff, what good explanation is there for why you shouldn't know what is in there? You should know it should be on cigarette packs. And don't some of the packs in the U.S. say, oh, this contains tar and nicotine and, all the different things? I thought that
Probably not all of them.
Yeah.
I mean, all of them would be quite a bit.
It would be.
There's a lot of stuff. So, yes, we are both in favor of full disclosure of ingredients on anything that is being consumed by someone.
Yeah.
And that includes, inhaling smoke or, drinking something. I think alcohol should have a list of ingredients.
Right.
All alcohol. It currently does not have to.
So you're saying if you have beer, for example, it should say, oh, there's hops, there's barley, whatever it is that's in there.
Yeah, because I want to know if there are preservatives or artificial colorings and flavorings in my beer. that's something I should know. And the FDA disagrees. But like we've said before, the FDA is pretty much a total joke.
Well, I think the FDA does do some good things, but they also, in some cases, get in the way of progress, and in other cases are actually proactively doing bad things. Now, I'm also noticing the picture you've selected. This is a little bit of an aggressive picture for this segment, isn't it?
Well, this is an example of what the packaging looks like in New Zealand. I mean,
it is quite aggressive.
It's quite aggressive. And is this as effective as a list of ingredients? I would say this is more effective because people aren't going to read
I'm finding this highly disturbing. Yeah, I'm not going to lie. This is a highly disturbing image to me.
Yeah.
Okay. So clearly, I have at this point no oversight over the pictures that go up on the screen, as people can tell. On the bonus show today, we have a lot on the bonus show today. One thing that we have on the bonus show is a story about police asset seizures and the amount of these seizures. It will be stunning to you if it is true. Of course, it is true. Only real stories on the bonus show. Starting now, though. I don't want to retroactively apply that. Fake stories on the bonus show previously. DavidPakman.com/membership. And of course, the calendar. DavidPakman.com/calendar16. Get the Hatriot Mail calendar. The thing is on fire. We can't even ship them out fast enough.
The David Pakman Show at DavidPakman.com.